Rejoice, episode 57, A Touch of Class. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're in chapter 2 of Ulysses, a chapter which goes by the name of Nestor. This is the part where Stephen has been teaching a class of Roman history. And there was a school in Dalkey, a suburb just south of Sandycove, where the book begins. It was called the Clifton School, set in a property called Summerfield Lodge. And Joyce was there briefly in the spring of 1904. The temporary teaching job that he applied for was advertised as a position for a gentleman usher. Now here Stephen has asked a boy named Armstrong if he knows anything about Pyrrhus, the king who took on the Roman Empire. Armstrong is much more interested in eating the biscuits, the cookies in his school satchel, and clearly knows very little about King Pyrrhus. Here's the quote, and there's a nice literary image coming up. "Pyrrhus, sir, appear." All laughed, mirthless, high, malicious laughter. Armstrong looked round at his colleagues, silly glee in profile. "In a moment they will laugh more loudly, aware of my lack of rule, and of the fees their papas pay." "Tell me now," Stephen said, poking the boy's shoulder with the book, "what is a pier?" "A pier, sir," Armstrong said. "A thing out in the water, a kind of a bridge. Kingstown Pier, sir." Some laughed again, mirthless, but with meaning. Two in the back bench whispered. Yes, they knew, had never learned, nor ever been innocent, all. With envy he watched their faces, Edith, Ethel, Gertie, Lily, their likes, their breaths, too, sweetened with tea and jam, their bracelets tittering in the struggle. End of quotation. Okay, let's have a go at this. Armstrong thinks that the word Pyrrhus is Latin or Greek or something for a pier. And of course there's a famous pier in the sea nearby at Kingstown, what is now called Dunleary. By the way, the pier has two arms at Dunleary. They come around the harbour like crab claws, not quite meeting, so that shipping can get in and out. And there's a local legend that the architect or the engineer or the builder, when the piers were finished, measured them and found that the east pier was 1.5 feet short, or long, or whatever, of the west pier. Since they were supposed to be identical, he took his life, jumped in the sea. A Pyrrhic victory, if you like. You never know with Joyce. Watch the text, though, because here you have again this thing that Joyce does so interestingly. He switches from what you might call standard third-person narration to the interior monologue that Joyce made famous, and that made Joyce famous, the technique whereby we hear the character's unspoken thoughts. I'll repeat the sentences for you. All laughed, mirthless, high, malicious laughter. Armstrong looked round at his classmates, silly glee in profile. Well, that's the third person, and here is Stephen's musing. In a moment they will laugh more loudly, aware of my lack of rule, and of the fees their papas pay. Well, apart from that switch of technique, there's nothing of multi-level interest there. So, next phrases. "Tell me now," Stephen said, poking the boy's shoulder with the book. "What is a pier?" "A pier, sir," Armstrong said. "A thing out in the water, a kind of a bridge. Kingstown Pier, sir." Well, I've repeated it, but it's straight enough, I think. Let me look. I like very much the way we see Stephen poking the boy's shoulder with the book. We actually see it, if you know what I mean. And we have Armstrong characterized as the class clown looking around in glee, pressing on with his idea of King Pyrrhus as a pier, the same Kingstown Pier that we had earlier, Dunleary Pier. And now comes the sticky bit, the interesting bit. "Some laughed again," says the text, mirthless but with meaning. Two in the back bench whispered. Well, that is, if you look at it, third-party narration, isn't it? Two in the back bench whispered. Yes, but here comes Stephen's thoughts again. Yes, he thinks, they knew, had never learned, nor ever been innocent, all. With envy he watched their faces, Edith, Ethel, Gertie, Lily, their likes, their breaths, too, sweetened with tea and jam, their bracelets tittering in the struggle. Let's try and unravel those sentences. What is Joyce doing here? Well, he's looking at these Protestant boys, and he's assuming that not only do they know about Pyrrhus, they know other things too. Here's the sociological terrain into which we've ambled, and it is fascinating. Take the two words, they knew. Take the word innocent, which they've never been. Take the word all. And then take the four names of the girls. Stephen, remember, is described as watching the boys' faces with envy. So what's he envying? He's envying the fact that these boys are already sexually experienced, and he's not. And the sociological reason for this? He's a Catholic, and it's a sin, sex before marriage. More crucially, he, being a Catholic, doesn't have access to and isn't allowed to use contraception, whereas the Protestants can. It's not against their religion. So, Protestant girls, when I was growing up, and certainly when Joyce was growing up, it's true too, were always more desirable because they were always more relaxed about sex, because they didn't fear getting pregnant, because they took what used to be called precautions, whereas Catholic girls took high risks, and if they were unlucky, had their lives ruined. How do we know all this in Ulysses? This is how we know. You look at the girls' names: Edith, Ethel, Gertie, Lily, and he says their likes. First of all, by and large, no Catholic girl would have those names. They'd be Bridget or Mary. By the way, Edith is Edie Boardman and Gertie is Gertie MacDowell, and I say that because you'll meet them here again several years from now in a separate chapter, and you'll be seeing them through the eyes of Mr. Leopold Bloom, whom you yet have to meet. I love Mr. Bloom. He's adorable. Don't you meet him. Lily's interesting. Lily's Lily Carlisle. Remember her? Now, she's a name that you've just heard because Stephen has just heard it being trotted out to Mulligan at the 40-foot. The red-haired girl, remember? We heard about her in, let me think, was it episode 52? Yes. Do you remember a chap named of Seymour, an acquaintance of Buck Mulligan, was spooning with this red-haired girl, Lily Carlisle, last night on, where? Kingstown Pier. So there you have the train of thought. So that's Lily, Gertie, and Edie accounted for. And Ethel, the fourth name? Well, see it as a name that Joyce just pulls out as being a typical Protestant girl's name, because there's no Ethel mentioned anywhere else in Ulysses, not at all. And not only that, there's a little class dig in here as well, because of all of these boys, not one of them doesn't come from an upper class or upper middle class family, but the girls, to judge from their names, are from lower down the scale. You know it from their names, and you'll certainly know it when you meet Gertie and Edie later on. And unfortunately, that's the last we hear of red-haired Lily Carlisle. A pity, I rather like the sound of her. So this segment, this paragraph, it's a little bit about class, and in a classroom. That's very Joyce. Finally, if you remember last week, we had that sentence about a sweetened boy's breath. And it's Armstrong who has been eating fig rolls. Stephen's musing on him, a sweetened boy's breath. Well, here's this from this week. You heard it earlier. Their breaths, too, sweetened with tea and jam, because they could afford to have sweeter breaths than the largely poorer Catholics. And here's a terrific line about the grapplings of young love. Their bracelets tittering in the struggle. Can't you just hear it? Love it. Rejoice, episode 58, A Disappointed Bridge. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're in chapter 2 of Ulysses, a chapter that goes by the name of Nestor. We still haven't met Joyce's version of Homer's, but we will. We're still in the classroom with Stephen teaching, as indeed Joyce himself did, in the spring of 1904, some months before the single day's events of Ulysses. He has just asked one of the boys, Armstrong, who or what was King Pyrrhus, and the best answer that Armstrong can offer is, Pyrrhus, sir, Pyrrhus, appear. After some distracting thoughts about the sex that these boys might be having with different girls, we had that last week in episode 57, Stephen returns to the lesson in hand. Here we go. I'll read this week's chunk in its entirety, and then we'll deconstruct it line by line. Kingstown Pier, Stephen said. Yes, a disappointed bridge. The words troubled their gaze. How, sir? Common asked. A bridge is across a river. For Haynes's chapbook. No one here to hear. Tonight, deftly, amid wild drink and talk, to pierce the polished mail of his mind. What then? A jester at the court of his master, indulged and disesteemed, winning a clement master's praise. Why had they chosen all that part? Not wholly for the smooth caress. For them, too, history was a tale like any other too often heard, their land pawn shop. End of quote. Now, in earnest, we're getting into the driving principle of how Ulysses was written. The premise is this: Stephen, being Joyce's own autobiographical avatar in reverse, so to speak. An avatar is a human manifestation of an immaterial figure such as a god. Stephen has a richly stocked mind, and when he's deep in thought, anything can be dredged up, and it can have direct or oblique relevance. And it's the oblique stuff that has caused Ulysses to be abandoned as too difficult. As you'll see later on in this great adventure of ours, when Mr. Bloom is deep in thought, anything can be dredged up too. And he's often obscure also, though obviously less erudite or replete with classical references than Stephen is. But then Mr. Bloom hasn't been to university, and he wasn't educated by the Jesuits. So, first of all here we have Stephen's rather nice joke, which the boys don't get. Kingstown Pier, Stephen said. Yes, a disappointed bridge. The words troubled their gaze. They really don't get it, do they? How, sir? Cummin asked. A bridge is across a river. See? Didn't get it at all. The rest of the segment, then, is entirely composed of Stephen's thoughts, and it's these that we need to decode. First obstacle. For Haynes's chapbook, he thinks, no one here to hear. Tonight, deftly, amid wild drink and talk, to pierce the polished mail of his mind. Remember Haynes the Englishman? Of course you do, whom we last saw watching Mulligan swim at the 40-foot at the end of chapter 1. Well, Haynes is in Ireland collecting essentially things Irish. He's passionate about things Irish. He wants to be a major collector of things Irish, folklore, tradition, songs, music. And Mulligan has already told Stephen that he, Stephen, should sell his bon mots, his brilliant remarks, to Haynes for a guinea each. Well, Stephen is now musing that perhaps tonight, because there's nobody there in the school to appreciate his wit, he will indeed sell that remark, that good joke, about a pier being a disappointed bridge, to Haynes to put in his book, the book he may write, his notebook, whatever, his chapbook. Let's nail chapbook here, because the word stands out, and whenever that happens, I've said this over and over, go for it. A chapbook was a slang name for a book because one of the first mass-market book publishers in England, was named Chapman. Not, of course, to be confused with the Chapman of John Keats's poem on first looking into Chapman's Homer. That was the Elizabethan translator of Homer. But since this is Ulysses, and therefore so intensely aware of Homer, Joyce managed to get part of the name Chapman in here. And by the way, the word chap, as in chapbook, comes originally from the German word cheap, and it meant a trader or a customer in commerce. So there you are, chaps. Have a good time, chaps, is what an Englishman would say. So Haynes the Englishman, chap as in chapbook, all ties together. Next line. Tonight, deftly, amid wild drink and talk, to pierce the polished mail of his mind. They'll meet in a pub, and there will be wild talk, and Stephen will land a blow, as in a joust. Haynes will be wearing the polished armour of the superior Englishman, but however smooth and traditional this English chain mail will be, the Irishman's wit will pierce it. Next line, though, betrays the futility. Stephen thinks, what then? A jester at the court of his master, indulged and disesteemed, winning a clement master's praise. In other words, the Irishman's role, should he prove wittier, and therefore intellectually superior to the Englishman, is reduced to that of court jester. And this is interesting. It was so long the case, and I saw it happen to people myself, that when the English, who were superior militarily and thus politically, wanted to bring the clever Irish under control, they turned them in to court jesters, made them out to be so entertaining, disesteemed them. Joyce believed that they did it, for instance, to Oscar Wilde. Oh, you Irish are so entertaining, tell us a joke. So Stephen is worried that Haynes will do the same to him, and thereby patronize him, and thereby reduce him. And he goes on to muse on the Irish, who allowed the English to do that to them. Why had they chosen all that part, is Stephen's mused question. The answer, not wholly for the smooth caress, in other words, not entirely just to make things easy. Or another way of putting it, was it a rougher weapon in an Irishman's hands than mere social oil, this wit? Well, here's the political knife going in. It goes in so easily you don't feel it. Here we go. For them, too, history was a tale like any other, too often heard, their land a pawn shop. A pawn shop. Remember we had the name Common, a boy called Common? There was a pawn shop, it's mentioned in Ulysses, I said that last week, owned by Cummins. But here's the reference again to history being a recurrent pattern. After Giambattista Vico, the Italian philosopher we mentioned last week, of whom Joyce was so fond, and the blade is in the word pawn shop, which refers to both England and Ireland as places where there is nothing original, nothing new. Everything has been, as the current our phrase goes, has been previously enjoyed, second-hand. The syndrome that Joyce, that most original of minds, loathed and feared. Second-hand thought, second-hand ideas. And from all that existed, he quarried his own highly original material. Talk about making gold from dross. That's Ulysses, as you will see. You probably have already seen it. Oh, and by the way, as for Kingstown Pier being a disappointed bridge, it was, and Dunleary still is, the major point of embarkation for England from Ireland, but as a pier. The mailboat ties up to a pier. The boat you get to go to England, you step on the pier and you step onto the boat. So, as a bridge, well, it didn't reach far enough to bridge the gap between the two countries. Rejoice, episode 59, A Tile Off the Roof. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're in chapter 2 of Ulysses, where Stephen is teaching a class of boys about King Pyrrhus, the king who defeated the Romans in 279 BC, but lost so many men in battle that his name gave rise to the term a Pyrrhic victory, where you win, but at almost unbearable cost. Stephen's thoughts continue as he's trying to elicit from a boy that he's teaching the details of Pyrrhus's life and death, and he has already asked another boy what the end of Pyrrhus was. Now, as we did last week, we join Stephen's thoughts. Here's this week's first paragraph. It's internal monologue. Had Pyrrhus not fallen by Beldam's hand in Argos, or Julius Caesar not been knifed to death? They are not to be thought away. Time has branded them, and fettered they are lodged in the room of the infinite possibilities they have ousted. But can those have been possible, seeing that they never were? Or was that only possible which came to pass? Weave, weaver of the wind. That's the end of the quote. Don't you love the word beldam, the old respectful word for grandmother or old woman? Belle as in beautiful, dame as in French for woman, B-E-L-T-A-M, Notre Dame, Notre Dame, there's nothing like a dame, etc., etc. Anyway, that's what Stephen Dedalus has been thinking as he teaches these well-to-do boys on a sunny summer morning outside Dublin. So, what have we here? Well, we have something important, actually, something at the core of James Joyce's literary behavior and philosophical attitude. Ulysses, as you well know, is about what happened in general in Dublin on the 16th of June 1904. That's the underpinning of the entire novel, The History of a Single Thursday. History. That's the key word here. Had Pyrrhus not fallen by a beldam's hand in Argos, or Julius Caesar not been knifed to death, these are two historical events. King Pyrrhus was hit on the head by an old woman who threw a roof tile at the Battle of Argos in 272 BC. Julius Caesar was assassinated by his own courtiers. Remember Shakespeare's line, et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus? I'm going to digress for a moment here and quote some Plutarch, because it illuminates Joyce and the fountains from which he drank. Plutarch is brilliant, by the way. He's a clean, clear window into the past of our civilization, and when he wrote his parallel lives biographies, he wrote glowingly of Pyrrhus. Here's Plutarch describing that incident of the woman, the beldam, who felled King Pyrrhus. Quote, "When she saw that her son below was battling with Pyrrhus, the woman was filled with fear, because of the danger her son was in. So she lifted up a roof tile with both her hands and hurled it down at Pyrrhus. It struck his head just below his helmet and smashed into the vertebrae at the base of his neck. His sight was blurred, and his hands lost their grip on the reins of his horse. Then he slid down from the horse and sprawled. A fellow by the name of Zopyrus, Z-O-P-Y-R-U-S, ran up to him, saw who he was, and dragged the king into a doorway just as Pyrrhus was beginning to get to his feet and recover from the blow of the tile. Intending to cut off the king's head, Zopyrus drew that short sword beloved of the Illyrians. But Pyrrhus gave him a look so dreadful, so awful, that Zopyrus was terrified. Yet even though his hands were shaking, he did it. He attempted the deed. However, because he was scared and confused, he didn't strike a clean blow. He managed only to slash King Pyrrhus along the mouth and chin, which caused great problems when finally severing the head. That's the end of Plutarch's quote. Now, after seeing what he read, we find that we can inspect Joyce's philosophy. That's not too strong a word. His address to the entity we call history is open to scrutiny. Stephen thinks they are not to be thought away. Time has branded them, and fettered they are lodged in the room of the infinite possibilities they have ousted. Ousted? Ha! I love this. He's saying that this is what happened. Caesar was stabbed, Pyrrhus was hit by a tile, but we must also consider what might have happened. What were the other possibilities ousted by the facts? Quote, "But can those have been possible, seeing that they never were? Or was that only possible which came to pass?" There, if you like, is almost a definition of the difference between history and fiction. If Pyrrhus had not been hit by the roof tile, but time has branded the fact that he was hit and reduced, and thereby easier to kill. A modern counterpart? Well, if the 20th of July bomb plot, say, had killed Hitler, if President Kennedy hadn't been assassinated in Dallas. Yes, they too are lodged in the room of the infinite possibilities they have ousted. Here's the crunch line, the core, in a sense, of Joyce's recapturing of a day that was crucial to him. Stephen asks his thoughts. But can those have been possible, seeing that they never were, or was that only possible which came to pass? It's worth repeating. Haven't you had that thought? Was that event in your life the only possible thing that could have happened? Were there alternatives? What if I had married this person, or not married that person, or not taken that other job, or not gone on that long journey? Joyce was big into Aristotle, and Aristotle essentially set out the principles of the creative writer, the inventor of fictions. Listen to this. If you're writing a novel, you're mostly taking things that never happened and making them look as though they did. In the Metaphysics, with that great opening sentence, "All men by nature desire to know." Isn't that some sentence? All men by nature desire to know. In Book 5 of the Metaphysics, written, remember, some 300 years before the birth of Christ, Aristotle argued the difference between when a thing is potential and when it is not yet potential. Here's the line I like. "A being," he said, "and that which is mean that some things are potentially, whereas others exist in complete reality." That's Joyce's point here, and indeed all through Ulysses. How much of what he wrote was real? That's clear enough. The streets, the pubs. That was Dublin in June 1904. How much was potential, and therefore imagined? The dialogue, the incidents, and so on. And he reinforces his schema from a creative point of view when Stephen's thought process concludes, "Weave, weaver of the wind." Why? Well, everywhere you go in legend and folklore, you find the figure of the weaver, or the motif of weaving. In Homer's Odyssey, Penelope sits at the loom weaving, and telling all her suitors that when the weaving's done, she'll be a free woman. But of course, as you know, she undoes it every night, so that she's never done, and she'll be there when Odysseus returns, and he'll scatter those suitors. Weavers had magical powers to predict, to prophesy, to weave into their patterns the future lives of others. Here's the tie-in, and I hope this nails it for you. Detach yourself from the facts. Imagine what might have happened. Be a weaver, and prophesy what would have become of King Pyrrhus, or should I say, what could have become of him. And here is Stephen, a young man in his early 20s, full of genuine, practical uncertainty. Now, it may be poetic to imagine alternatives to history, until it comes to your own life, and you want to know what in God's name your future holds. In Stephen Needless's case, he didn't even know where he was going to sleep that night. That's it for this week. Do please join me here again next Wednesday for our further excursions into Ulysses. Rejoice! Episode 60, Living at This Hour. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're still in Chapter 2 of Ulysses, and we will be for some time. Stephen Dedalus has been, not very energetically, teaching a class of boys who have been learning not very energetically. They pick up his lackadaisical mood, and they try to distract him further. Here's the next piece of text. "Tell us a story, sir. Oh, do, sir, a ghost story." "Where do you begin in this?" Stephen asked, opening another book. "Weep no more," Common said. "Go on then, Talbot." "And the story, sir?" "After," Stephen said. "Go on, Talbot." A swarthy boy opened a book and propped it nimbly under the breastwork of his satchel. He recited jerks of verse with odd glances at the text. "Weep no more, woeful shepherds, weep no more for Lycidas. Your sorrow is not dead, sunk though he be beneath the watery floor." End of quote. Now, you may have studied John Milton's Lycidas, or part of it, at school or college. "Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour," Wordsworth wrote. Milton was 29 when he wrote Lycidas, and he wrote it to commemorate the death of a friend who died off a ship in the Irish Sea. Now, why did Joyce load in Lycidas at this stage of the game? I mean, he could have chosen any poem in the English language. Well, let me offer you some ideas. 1. Milton went blind. Joyce almost went blind himself in later life. And, as you'll discover, Stephen has difficulty with sight and eyeglasses in Ulysses. Watch this space. For several years. 2. Was Joyce perhaps making a kind of reparation to the ghost of Milton, about whom he had been very sniffy as a student? But, in fairness, Lycidas and Milton have always divided opinion. Some think it's the greatest poem ever written. Others think Milton is coarse. 3. Think back to the end of the previous chapter, when there's discussion of a drowning accident earlier in June 1904, a drowning accident off the coast of Dublin, so another drowning in the Irish Sea, if you like. Now, there's a clue in the very next sentence. That's the first sentence of the next passage. Stephen's thought process, into which we delved last week, has been continuing, and he thinks, I quote, "It must be a movement, then, an actuality of the possible as possible," unquote. Do you remember the difference that Joyce has been discussing beneath the surface? We talked about it last week, from Aristotle's metaphysics and poetics. The difference of what is real and what is potential, therefore of what has actually happened and of what might be imagined to happen or yet to happen. Here's a point that helps me. See if it helps you. In Lycidas, the drowned friend's name was Edward King, and we've just been dealing with another king, King Pyrrhus. Edward King's body was never discovered, and in Aristotle's terms, you can push the thought and ask, did he drown? Was it real? Was it an actuality? Now, stay on this train of thought. The body, at the end of Chapter 1, drowned in the Irish Sea 9 days, as I said, before the 16th of June, 9 days before Stephen gazed out on the waters and wondered whether it would show up by a boat, what Joyce called waiting for a swollen bundle to bob up, roll over to the sun, a puffy face, salt white. Was that body actual? No. There was a legend, of course, that it took 9 days for a drowned body to surface, but Stephen was imagining it, and in poetic terms. And isn't it the case, as Aristotle would and did argue, that the drowning or any such incident only becomes actual when the proof, the body, shows up? That, after all, is when the drowning does become an actuality. You can have an autopsy, an inquest. It becomes part of people's history. That would chime with Aristotle's words, remember last week when he talked about potential. The fulfillment of what exists potentially insofar as it exists potentially is motion. In this case, that would be, wouldn't it, the motion of a body popping up salt white out of the sea. And, just to round it off, Lycidas is a poem about a man who doesn't exist anymore, who is now in the imagination only because he has disappeared. So Joyce reached for that to illuminate his own thoughts about history. If it can be seen, it's a fact. If it has to be imagined, It's poetic. He was standing in the footprints of his master Aristotle. That's very, very Joyce. Let me go back, though, for a moment to today's quotation. You can further see the thought process in Joyce's head. The boys asked for a ghost story, for example. We're talking dead men here. Secondly, the swarthy boy is reciting, his name is Talbot. He props the poetry book in a hiding place. Under the breastwork of his satchel is the quote, and he tries to sneak helpful glances at the text as he's reciting what he's supposed to have memorized. And here, now, let me tie the entire thing together. These are the lines that Talbot recites. They bear repeating right now for our purposes. Just wait. Weep no more, he says, woeful shepherds, weep no more. For Lycidas, your sorrow is not dead, sunk though he be beneath the watery floor. Well, he's not dead, because his dead body hasn't appeared, just what we've been talking about. And the line, sunk though he be beneath the watery floor. Think back, or go back and listen to it again. Think back to Stephen at the end of chapter 1, reflecting on the drowned man out in Dublin Bay, and recalling Shakespeare's lines of Ariel's song from The Tempest. Full fathom 5, thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Now, there's food for thought. What's the sea change? From the imagined into the actual? That would be a sea change into something rich and strange. More next week, and by the way, this Friday, that's 2 days from now, we have a bonus edition, as I've been doing every dozen broadcasts. Goodbye until then. Rejoice, episode 60A, The Writing of Ulysses. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. And this is yet another bonus edition. We have them every 12 broadcasts or so, and this time I want to concentrate on a particular friendship that James Joyce formed, and to which we owe a great deal of knowledge about the actual writing of Ulysses. I'll return to this topic more than once, you can be sure of that. Now, you can have a very good debate as to when Joyce began to write Ulysses. In my own mind, I connect it to the writing of his previous work, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, for the very obvious reason that Ulysses begins a few months after the portrait leaves off in the life of Stephen Dedalus, who is, of course, major to both books. In 1904, James Joyce, like Stephen, was himself a nervous, impecunious young man, afflicted with early eye difficulties, awkward in every relationship in his life, grieving after the death of his mother, uncertain as to how he should form his own life view, seeking a firm path to his own set of philosophies, and with no true and permanent place to rest his head at night. You can see a connection here immediately in Stephen to Homer's Odyssey. Even though it's Mr. Bloom we're invited to see as Odysseus, navigating the rocks and shoals of the world that is Dublin, with Molly, his Penelope, waiting at home, there's a real sense in which the autobiographical Stephen figure has also begun to wander. In practical terms, though, when did Joyce begin to write Ulysses? Well, believe it or not, he first conceived of it as a short story, and in 1906. The novel, remember, didn't appear until 1922. That's 16 years later. He was living in Rome in 1906, revising for his first major publication, the short story collection Dubliners, and he wrote to his brother Stanislaus in Dublin asking for details of a particular Jewish gentleman in Dublin by name Alfred Hunter. Now, I won't digress with Hunter here. We will hear a great deal more of him. But Hunter had an unfaithful wife, according to gossip, and Joyce was also interested in the details of a Jewish divorce case in Dublin. But whatever his thoughts, as a short story, the negative, so to speak, didn't develop, and Joyce abandoned the idea of Ulysses in the shorter form. The seed, however, was in the ground, and even though other work was growing up all around, the plant had taken root. Although he wrote to his brother in February 1907 that he was no farther forward with the idea of the short story. So, was there then a moment in which he sat down at his writing table and announced to himself or to anyone else, I am now writing a big book which I will call Ulysses? No. From that first short story idea, it germinated and grew like any decent artistic expression until a moment came when the book insisted, and Joyce began to have a plan that he could talk about. Here's a capsule in one sentence of how it grew. In June 1915, he wrote a postcard to his brother, saying that he now had a plan for 22 chapters. And in May 1918, 2 years and 11 months later, he wrote to his patron, Harriet Shaw Weaver, that the book would have 17 chapters. Eventually, he increased that to 18. In that same summer of 1918, Joyce met a man to whom anyone interested in Ulysses owes this great debt that I talked about, owes it for his kindness, his generosity, his artistic appreciation and understanding, and his painterly powers of observation. His name was Frank Budgeon, not the film director, not the blues musician. This Frank Budgeon worked for the English Foreign Office, and he was stationed in the Zurich consulate. This was at the end of the First World War, and Joyce had been living in neutral Switzerland to avoid getting caught up and interned as a suspect alien somewhere. A colleague from the British Cultural Affairs Department in Zurich introduced Frank Budgeon to Joyce. They immediately became drinking companions and close friends. Joyce respected and asked for Budgeon's opinion on his work. And in time, Budgeon wrote a book that I love and treasure. It's called James Joyce and the Making of Ulysses. It's delicious. It was published in 1934, and Joyce, no end of a curmudgeon, actually approved of it with delight. He didn't often do that. He said to Budgeon, "I never knew you could write so well. It must be due to your association with me." The two men first met at a dinner party, and for much of the evening, Joyce, the paranoid's paranoid, stayed aloof, because he was suspicious that Budgeon was a British spy sent to trail Joyce. Here, however, is Budgeon's description of the meeting, and note his artist's eye for visual detail. Joyce, by the way, in these descriptions, he's what? Let me do the math. He's 36 years old. Budgeon wrote, I'm quoting from the book now, I have it here in front of me. Where are we? I saw a tall, slender man come into the garden through the restaurant. Swinging a thin cane, he walked deliberately down the steps to the gravelled garden path. He was a dark mass against the orange light of the restaurant glass door, but he carried his head with the chin uplifted, so that his face collected cool light from the sky. His walk, as he came slowly across to us, suggested that of a wading heron. The studied deliberateness of a latecomer, I thought at first, but then as he came nearer, I saw his heavily glassed eyes, and realized that the transition from light interior to darkening garden had made him unsure of a space beset with iron chairs and tables and other obstacles. Budgeon goes on with this. This is the next paragraph. Yes, here we are. Joyce's greeting to us is of elaborate European politeness, but his manner, I think, is distant, his handshake cool. Close up, he looks not so tall, though he is well above average height. The deception is due to his slender build, his buttoned coat, and narrow-cut trousers. Then he listens to, not looks at his man. The form of his head is the long oval of heads of the Norman race. His hair is dark enough to look black in this light. His beard is much lighter, orangey brown and cut to a point, Elizabethan. Behind the powerful lenses of his spectacles, his eyes are a clear, strong blue, but uncertain in shape and masked in expression. I notice later that in a moment of suspicion or apprehension, they become a sky-blue glare. The colour of his face is a bricky red, evenly distributed. The high forehead has a forward thrust as it issues from under the front rank of hair. His jaws firm and square, his lips thin and tight, set in a straight line. I have here in my office, and I'm looking at it now, Joyce's death mask, and that, I can tell you, is a very accurate description. Budgeon goes on to remark that something in Joyce's head suggests that he might be an alchemist. It's easy to imagine him, observes Budgeon, moving around a room full of furnaces, retorts, and books full of diagrams. And again he makes the comparison to a tall marsh fowl, watchful and preoccupied. Well, That's how and when the friendship began. And how could Joyce, even suspicious, paranoid Joyce, how could he not be friendly with another artist who perceived him so clearly and reported him so completely? From more or less that moment, Frank Budgeon became a major sounding board for the writing of Ulysses. Joyce warmed to Budgeon because Budgeon reminded him, he said, of an English cricketer named Arthur Shrewsbury. Joyce was keen on cricket. Though this Shrewsbury was an awkward-looking character, Budgeon took it as a compliment. The next time they met, Joyce said to him, "I'm now writing a book based on the wanderings of Ulysses. The Odyssey, that is to say, serves me as a ground plan. Only my time is recent time, and all my heroes' wanderings take no more than 18 hours." End of quote. Well, the conversation between the writer and the painter, between Joyce and Budgeon, was now up and running. I will return to it in my next special, 12 episodes from now, because it's full of fascinating insight as to how Joyce chose his characters. For instance, he asked Budgeon, "Do you know of any complete all-round character presented by any writer?" They discussed many fictional creations, from Balzac to Shakespeare. And upon whom did they settle? That will be something for the next Baker's Dozen edition. And the usual podcast will, of course, be here next Wednesday when we continue with Chapter 2 of James Joyce's Ulysses. Rejoice, Episode 61, In a Paris Library. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're slightly longer this week as we continue with a complicated piece of Chapter 2 of Ulysses. Stephen Dedalus, as you probably already know, is teaching in a private school south of Dublin, and here, as a boy is reading John Milton's poem Lycidas, are Stephen's thoughts, and he's picking up on where we were last week, deep in a discussion of Aristotle's tenets about the difference between essentially what is real and what is potential. The real we can see, the potential we can only imagine. And to remind you of Aristotle's phrase, as it now exercises Stephen, quote, "The fulfillment of what exists potentially, insofar as it exists potentially, is motion." End of quote. Now, in Joyce's interior monologue, Stephen picks up that thought. Here's the quote as he thinks it, and it's followed by a glimpse into Joyce's own life. In 1902 and 1903, he spent brief sojourns in Paris trying to become a medical student. Here we go. Stephen's thinking, "It must be a movement, then, an actuality of the possible as possible." Aristotle's phrase formed itself within the gabbled verses and floated out into the studious silence of the library of Sainte-Geneviève, where he had read, sheltered from the sin of Paris, night by night. By his elbow a delicate Siamese conned a handbook of strategy. "Fed and feeding brains about me, under glow lamps impaled with faintly beating feelers, and in my mind's darkness a sloth of the underworld, reluctant, shy of brightness, shifting her dragon scaly folds. Thought is the thought of thought. Tranquil brightness, the soul is in a manner all that is. The soul is the form of forms. Tranquility, sudden, vast, candescent, form of forms." End of quote. And let me count. There are, by my count, about a dozen references in there that require decoding. So off we go. Quote, "It must be a movement, then, an actuality of the possible as possible." This, which I've taken over from last week from episode 60, is Joyce agreeing with Aristotle, and it will crop up again, and we'll come across it attached to a famous phrase from Ulysses. Stephen, here's his Aristotelian thought. "Within the gabbled verses," that's the schoolboy Talbot attempting to show that he has memorized Lycidas, but is in reality sneaking peeks at his book, which he has hidden behind his school satchel on his desk. The next phrase doesn't need that much deconstruction, and it does capture a moment that Joyce must have experienced, the studious silence of the library of Sainte-Geneviève, where he had read, sheltered from the sin of Paris, night by night. Well, as for sheltering from the sin of Paris night by night, Joyce scarcely saw any such hedonistic enjoyment, because he was as poor as a church mouse while he was there, and his dominant memory of Paris seems to be one of acute hunger and of being stony broke all the time. He was constantly writing home for money, and he finally ended his spell there when his father sent him a telegram to say that he had better come home because his mother was dying. It's a famous moment in Joyce's own biography. But wait a minute. He's particular about the library in which he studied, Saint Genevieve, and we know by now, don't we, that when James Joyce is that specific, he had something in mind. What, therefore, is the Saint Genevieve reference? Yes, there is such a place name in Paris to this day, but how and why is Joyce using it? Ha ha! I might have known. I can give you a number of reasons. First of all, Genevieve was long the patron saint of Paris. Secondly, she was renowned for fasting, which Joyce was doing in Paris. She was an early vegetarian who subsisted on very little food, while Joyce himself was starving in Paris. Thirdly, she was cast as a early medieval shepherdess, and Lycidas, in the poem by John Milton, currently being taught by Stephen, is cast as a shepherd. Both came from more prosperous backgrounds. Lycidas and Genevieve had that in common. Fourthly, when Genevieve was feared and condemned by the citizens of Paris as a fraud and perhaps a witch, they threatened to drown her, and we've been dealing in drownings lately, haven't we? You see? Joyce never does anything without a reason. Several reasons, actually. Next reference in this week's quote, strange one, comes in out of the blue, out of left field, so to speak. By his elbow, a delicate Siamese conned a handbook of strategy. Look this one up. The year was 1903, and France and Britain were still the colonial ruling powers in parts of Asia, whereas Siam, which today we call Thailand, held a kind of balance of power between them. Eventually, Indochina, Landochin, the French colony, fell and turned into all kinds of carnage. The British Empire shrank also, and Siamese politicians continued to negotiate for their country's delicate balance, and their political students evidently studied at night in the libraries of Paris. By the way, don't you love the word conned? Conned, a handbook of strategy. It's a very old word, meaning to know or to get to know, to scan, to peruse, to pore over, to study, to memorize. An old English word. First came into common use around the 15th, 16th century. And of course, you know that it also means a confidence trick, or it's short for prisoner, a convict. I'd love to know whether Joyce actually knew a Siamese student who was conning political strategy. Because in 1904, the year in which he sets Ulysses, there was a major Franco-Siamese conference deciding the future of Siam, and he'd certainly have seen that reported in the newspapers. Where are we? I've gone off the track. No, I haven't. Here we are. Let me pick up the quote. Fed and feeding brains about me, under glow lamps, impaled with faintly beating feelers, and in my mind's darkness a sloth of the underworld, reluctant, shy of brightness, shifting her dragon scaly folds. End of quote. I love this. The image of a library as some kind of animal or insect farm, with the antennae of the students waving gently under the library lights. And the next phrase, and in my mind's darkness a sloth of the underworld, reluctant, shy of brightness, shifting her dragon scaly folds. This is the purest of writing. The author openly allowing us to get near the narrator's thought process. What is Stephen thinking here? What does Joyce mean? Down in the recesses of his brain, something is stirring. Is it a dragon? Ha! Now, do you remember some weeks ago when we talked about William Blake, that wonderful 18th century eccentric English mystic and poet? One of the things you have to watch out for, you'll see this all through the book, one of the things you have to watch out for in Ulysses is the sheer length of Joyce's trains of thought. Here's a quotation from Blake's piece, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which we came across much earlier. Here's the sentence. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. I was in a printing house in hell, and saw the method in which knowledge is transmitted from generation to generation. In the first chamber was a dragon man, clearing away the rubbish from a cave's mouth. Within, a number of dragons were hollowing the cave. End of Blake's quote. And there's Stephen Daedalus in a cavernous building full of printed text by which man transmits knowledge down the centuries, and look at where he then takes us. Thought is the thought of thought. Tranquil brightness. The soul is in a manner all that is. The soul is the form of forms. Tranquility. Sudden, vast, candescent, form of forms. Just before the dragon-man line, Blake observes, but first, the notion that man has a body distinct from his soul has to be expunged. And here, among the dragon's scaly folds, Blake meets Aristotle, and we see the beginnings of a discussion regarding soul. At the end of that passage, Blake actually mentions Aristotle, and Stephen has already been considering Aristotle's view, and now Blake's, that the soul is the absolute essence of any living thing. Is Stephen here breaking through into a relieved, more pleasant view of the soul? I think so, because his final thought is tranquil brightness. The soul is in a manner all that is. The soul is the form of forms, tranquility, sudden, vast, candescent form of forms. You could feel the relief. You would expect such thoughts about the soul, wouldn't you, from a young man who has lately been thinking of a body about to reappear in the sea, and whose own mother has recently died, but who has had great doubts about the soul and wishes that she had one and that it is safe. More next week. Join me then. Read Joyce, episode 62 of God and Caesar. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Chapter 2 of Ulysses. Nestor continues. We haven't yet met Nestor, after whom the chapter is named. We shall soon. But we have met the schoolboy who was reading from Lycidas, John Milton's famed poet about a drowned friend. The boy reciting is named Talbot, and he's actually doing it sneakily because he has failed to learn the poem, and he's hidden his open book where he thinks that Stephen Dedalus won't see it. You know all that from last week and the week before. Now, so to speak, read on. This week's passage is a little less dense, so we can afford more of it. Here's the quote. Talbot repeated, "Through the dear might of him that walked the waves, through the dear might—" "Turn over," Stephen said quietly. "I don't see anything." "What, sir?" Talbot asked simply, bending forward. His hand turned the page over. He leaned back and went on again, having just remembered. "Of him that walked the waves. Here also, over these craven hearts his shadow lies, and on the scoffer's heart and lips, and on mine. It lies upon their eager faces who offered him a coin of the tribute. To Caesar what is Caesar's, to God what is God's. A long look from dark eyes, a riddling sentence to be woven and woven on the church's looms. Aye! Riddle me, Randy, oh, my father gave me seeds to sow." Talbot slid his clothes book into his satchel. "Have I heard all?" Stephen asked. "Yes, sir. Hockey at 10, sir." "Half day, sir. Thursday." "Who can answer a riddle?" Stephen asked. They bundled their books away, pencils clacking, pages rustling. Crowding together, they strapped and buckled their satchels, all gabbling gaily. "A riddle, sir." "Ask me, sir." "Oh, ask me, sir." "A hard one, sir." "This is the riddle," Stephen said. End of quotation. Now, what have we got here? Well, the first part's not that obscure. Stephen gently tells the boy Talbot that he, Stephen the teacher, doesn't see that Talbot is reading from the surreptitious book. In fact, Stephen, in a fit of kindness, probably from the relief at getting a new and positive view of the soul through his own contemplation of the works of William Blake and Aristotle, is, in fact, conspiring with the boy. I have great affection for the teachers I remember who used to do that. He even tells him to turn over the page, so let me repeat the next lines. His hand, that's Talbot's hand, turned the page over. He leaned back and went on again, having just remembered. Talbot's memory has just been jogged by a quick glance at the page. Haven't we all been through that? And then Stephen lapses into reflection at the lines that Talbot has just quoted from Milton's Lycidas. Here's the reflection. "Through the dear might of him that walked the waves." That's the line. Stephen naturally picks up the reference and connects the line of the poem to the Gospels, the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed that I lay on, and the descriptions of Christ walking in the waters. And he re-enters in his mind the debates with religion hinted at in chapter 1 with Mulligan and Haynes the Englishman. Here's Stephen's thought. "Here also over these craven hearts his shadow lies, and on the scoffer's heart and lips, and on mine. It lies upon their eager faces, who offered him a coin of the tribute. To Caesar what is Caesar's, to God what is God's." Again, a quote from the Gospels. And the thought is that such a God as Jesus was held sway over those who mocked him too, including Mulligan and Stephen the disbeliever. And if you know your scriptures, you'll recall the description. It's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke for certain. I can't remember. If it's in John. You'll remember how the Pharisees tried to make Jesus utter seditious statements. They quizzed him about paying taxes to the Romans, one of the hot buttons of the day. You probably already know that some historians, non-theologians, claim that Jesus was executed because he opposed the payment of taxes to Rome. So the Pharisees produced a coin which naturally had Caesar's head on it, and Christ said to them, in what is perhaps his most famously ambiguous statement, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Now, I love this. Note Joyce's phrase, Stephen's thought, that is, "a long look from dark eyes." That was the look that Christ gave his questioners. He's always been portrayed as having brown eyes because he was from the Middle East. And the ambiguous statement that he made has been discussed endlessly in the debates within the Christian churches. That's what Stephen's mind calls, quote, "a riddling sentence to be woven and woven on the church's looms," unquote. Woven and woven picks up the earlier weaving references, which, as we dealt with, have to do with both conspiracy and prophecy. The word riddling, though, echoes forward in his mind, and his next thought is the opening line of a riddle, the way we used to tell riddles when I was a boy in Ireland. "Riddle me, Randy Rowe, my father gave me seeds to sow." And then, finally, for this week, we have reportage narrative. Talbot slid his closed book into his satchel. "Have I heard all?" Stephen asks him. Talbot replies, "Yes, sir, we have hockey at 10, sir." And then somebody else says that there's a half day, it's Thursday. And Stephen, just to have them, just for one last moment, and to leave an impression in their minds, he says, "Who can answer a riddle?" And as Joyce describes, they bundled their books away, pencils clacking, pages rustling, crowding together, they strapped and buckled their satchels, all gabbling gaily, "A riddle, sir? Ask me, sir. Oh, ask me, sir. A hard one, sir." "This is the riddle," Stephen said. And I, this is mean of me, but I'm going to do it. I will tell you next week what the riddle is. Rejoice, episode 63, A Lot of Nonsense. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. At slightly greater length, I fear, because it's a bit complex, but we are going to have fun. Last week we found Stephen in chapter 2 of Ulysses uttering that old phrase, riddle me, Randy Rowe, because he's asking the schoolboys a riddle. He's finished with teaching them, and they're scheduled to go and play field hockey. I recognize the form of this riddle so well. Our version was, riddle me, Randy-o, my father gave me seeds to sow. The seeds were black and the ground was white. Riddle me that or I'll give you a fight. Answer? Someone writing a letter. Black ink, the seeds on white paper. There's an alternative ending, riddle me that and I'll buy you a pint. So let's pick up on the riddle from Ulysses last week. Here we go. Quote, "Who can answer a riddle?" Stephen asked. They bundled their books away, pencils clacking, pages rustling, crowding together. They strapped and buckled their satchels, all gabbling gaily. "A riddle, sir. Ask me, sir. Oh, ask me, sir. A hard one, sir." "This is the riddle," Stephen said. "The cock crew, the sky was blue, the bells in heaven were striking 11. 'Tis time for this poor soul to go to heaven." "What is that?" "What, sir?" "Again, sir." "We didn't hear." Their eyes grew bigger as the lines were repeated. After a silence, Cochrane said, "What is it, sir? We give it up." Stephen, his throat itching, answered, "The fox burying his grandmother under a holly bush." He stood up and gave a shout of nervous laughter, to which their cries echoed dismay. A stick struck the door, and a voice in the corridor called, "Hockey!" They broke asunder, sidling out of their benches, leaping them. Quickly they were gone, and from the lumber room came the rattle of sticks and clamour of their boots and tongues. That's the end of the quote. The fox burying his grandmother under a holly bush. What in God's name is James Joyce doing now? Have you ever wondered just how foolhardy an exercise of mine this might be? Well, I have. To deconstruct every reference in Ulysses, or as many as I can, and I mean to attempt them all. It's well known that there's a number of ways in which you can go mad. Actually, this piece of text isn't as bad, as meaninglessly obscure as it seems. More interesting, is the reason why Stephen would reach for a riddle at this moment, and we come to that. Let's hear the riddle again. The cock crew, the sky was blue, the bells in heaven were striking 11. 'Tis time for this poor soul to go to heaven. And what's the answer? The fox burying his grandmother under a holly bush. This is what it is. There's a fine tradition, ages old, of nonsense in discourse and dialogue. 'Twas brillig and the slidey toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. That's one of the best known pieces, too, of nonsense by Lewis Carroll, and you might even argue that much of his Alice in Wonderland is in the realm of nonsense. That is to say, attractive-sounding language with sometimes brilliant words, neologisms, newly made-up words, which seem possibly to have some meaning, but in the analysis don't amount to anything. There was a lot of that kind of English language nonsense about when I was growing up. There was Edward Lear, that charming, dotty 19th century writer and artist, credited wrongly credited, with having invented the form of verse known as the limerick. This is one of Lear's. There was an old lady of Chertsey who made a remarkable curtsy. She twirled round and round till she sank underground, which distressed all the people of Chertsey. Lear also wrote The Pobble Who Has No Toes, and it's perfectly known that a pobble's toes are safe provided he minds his nose. We had stacks of nonsense as children. Children love nonsense. Rah, rah, roodly rah, who's the bird that was your da? Or, I heard this one not long ago, only a few years ago. Tickety-pickety, wickety-woo, I never will do what I have to do. And not having done what I have just done means I have plenty of time for fun. Now, we bring into the nonsense, we bring in the riddle element. My sister asked me this a long time ago. I think I was only about 9 or 10 at the time. Why is a mouse when it spins? Answer, the higher, the fewer. It means nothing. It's not meant to. But it does put pleasing shapes into your mouth, and it does send pleasing sounds out in the air. Here's another one. Why did the man put his hand in the bucket? Answer, to test the height of the clouds. I just made that up just this minute. Try it. It's great fun. But we can go deeper than that, because riddles, found, by the way, in every general language in the world, riddles have other functions. To stimulate, to address forms of logic, to make you look at things from a new angle. Here's one that a teacher gave us in school. What runs all around the garden, all day, every day, and never comes into the garden? Do you give up? The path. The path runs all around the garden all day, every day, and never comes into the garden. Now, try this. When you finish listening to this podcast, try this. Ask someone near you a riddle. Watch them. They'll be unable not to become engaged. So, forgive the digression, Stephen Dedalus proposes a riddle to the boys in the Clifton School, and he then delivers it, and the boys are blank, wide-eyed, silent, even though they asked for a hard riddle. And they give up. He barks the answer, the fox burying his grandmother under a holly bush. Well, where did all this come from? Enter now, and I'm delighted to share him with you, a man who is part of my inner population and has been for a long, long time. His name was Joyce, too, Patrick Weston Joyce. No relation so far as I know, but the Joyces were such a small clan that I bet there must have been a cousinage or a kinship somewhere. P.W. Joyce, as he was known professionally, came from places near where I grew up. He lived for a time near the border between the counties of Cork and Tipperary. He taught in our county town, Clonmel. My father went to hear him give a talk once. This Joyce, P.W. Joyce, was a historian, a folklore collector, and a specialist in language. He created important works about place names and their origins, about old Irish music and song, and about the English language as the Irish spoke it. And in one of his books, he has this riddle. Riddle me right, what did I see last night? The wind blew, the cock crew, the bells of heaven struck 11. 'Tis time for my poor soul to go to heaven. And the answer was the fox burying his mother, note that, his mother under a holly bush. It was all nonsense, as P.W. Joyce makes clear. James Joyce conflates two riddles here. His riddle me Randy-o, or as he called it, Randy Rowe, comes from the one I quoted from my own knowledge about the letter writing. The seeds were black and the ground was white, so on and so forth. But the second part, about the cock crowing and the bells of heaven, P.W. Joyce collected that, and he included it in the book he published in 1910, English as We Speak It in Ireland. So, there's the literal root of Stephen's puzzling riddle. And note that when Stephen gives the boys the nonsense answer, he doesn't say the fox burying his mother. That's too close to his own recent bereavement, so he says grandmother. And there's one last twist and wrinkle, and this is wonderful. Over the past few weeks, we've spent time on Aristotle, because he's been part of Stephen's thoughts. Well, guess who had a great fondness and respect for riddles? Aristotle. How modern he sounds, discussing metaphor and simile and riddles. This is what he had to say. Metaphors must be drawn from things that are related to the original thing, and yet not obviously so related. Liveliness is specially conveyed by metaphor, and by the further power of surprising the hearer, because the hearer expected something different. His acquisition of the new idea impresses him all the more. His mind seems to say, "Ah, yes, to be sure, I never thought of that." Well, says Aristotle, constructed riddles are attractive for the same reason. A new idea is conveyed, and there is metaphorical expression. Here is Stephen Dedalus, uncertain, somewhat lost, sad after his mother has died, disturbed at the hostility of Mulligan in the Tower and the discomfort of all that needling and jibing, and puzzled about his way forward, about his future. He needs stimulation. He needs lively thinking to take him forward. He needs answers. So James Joyce comes up with a riddle attached to his own namesake, P.W. Joyce. What do I have to say? Well, there's only one thing I can say in those circumstances, and I say it here every week and will for years to come. I say rejoice, and on the double. Rejoice, episode 64, Blind Man's Bluff. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney, and we continue with Chapter 2 of Ulysses, which is today known as Nestor. Incidentally, Joyce himself did not designate chapters or titles for the divisions of the novels. He did, though, have a plan, an overall schema, but he didn't want too many people to know it. He said, to hold on to the book's mystery. And then a scholar, Stuart Gilbert, heard about it because Joyce had, in fact, shared it with some people. And Stuart Gilbert released it in his own book about Ulysses in 1931, a book that became and remains a book of major renown in Joycean scholarship, and that's an arena I'm sure I'll address in a future bonus edition. Here's the next passage from Chapter 2, and I've overlapped it a little from last week. Stephen has been teaching a class of boys, and now they're quitting to go and play hockey. That's what's known in some countries as field hockey, as distinct from ice hockey. And incidentally, that's also a social note from Joyce, because only upper-class children, and mainly Protestant, played hockey in Ireland. It was an English game, a garrison game they called it, and therefore to the Catholic majority, an unpatriotic pursuit. I myself never played, but only because there was little opportunity. I relished playing the other stigmatized English games, soccer and rugby. It was such nonsense bringing politics into sport. Anyway, enough ranting. Here's the text. Here's the quote. They broke asunder, sidling out of their benches, leaping them. Quickly they were gone, and from the lumber room came the rattle of sticks and clamour of their boots and tongues. That's the overlap brought forward from last week. Nothing deep or impenetrable there. That's just straight narrative, though note again how clearly we see the picture. That's just good writing, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely clear. Let's continue. Here's the text. Sergeant, who alone had lingered, came forward slowly, showing an open copybook. His thick hair and scraggy neck gave witness of unreadiness, and through his misty glasses, weak eyes looked up, pleading. On his cheek, dull and bloodless, a soft stain of ink lay, date-shaped, recent and damp as a snail's bed. He held out his copybook. The word "sums" was written on the headline. Beneath were sloping figures, and at the foot a crooked signature with blind loops and a blot. Cyril Sargent, his name and seal. That's the end of the quotation. Sargent is a boy who has to stay behind and have his work checked. From the description, he is noticeably below par. A weakling, sloppily presented, ink-stained with poor sight. Now, on the face of it, this is all straightforward enough, but let's have a crack at it. Let's dig a little. First, take his name. Here's a boy, perhaps the most unattractive and lower-down boy in the class in this private school for the children of affluent parents. That's what the school is, private school. And what's his name? Sergeant. There were sergeants living in Dublin in 1904, though not conveniently close to the school as Joyce locates it. Therefore, Joyce has to have had another reason for choosing the name, and I believe it to be this. All his life, Joyce railed against authority. He drew a stick along the railings of the establishment. He even sued authority figures. A sergeant, whether policeman or soldier, is an authority figure. And here, Joyce takes a name that has the ring of officialdom and authority, and gives it to a most unattractive and evidently weak boy. The satire continues with the name Cyril, which in the original Greek means superior, or, and this is really interesting, master. And this is what I've really been going after here. The boy is anything but a master. The true master, that is to say, the school teacher here, is of course Stephen. And Stephen is based on Joyce himself. And the seal, the sign of grandeur, Cyril Sargent, his name and his seal. Can you imagine a creature less likely than poor Sargent to have so grand an emblem as a personal seal? And a sudden thought, did he look like a seal? So, are we seeing a self-portrait of the artist as a boy, painted by a depressed man, as Stephen is in these opening chapters of Ulysses? Indeed, he doesn't brighten up too much throughout the entire text either. Jolly is not the word I'd reach for to describe him. And are we also seeing here a piece of true artistic writing? Well, we sure are. Let me look at it again. Do I glimpse a flash of something? See this line? Listen. Through his misty glasses, weak eyes looked up, pleading. Well, I have a photograph of Joyce, taken when he was about Stephen's age, early 20s, and the eyes are big and moon-like, a calf's eyes almost, and if not quite pleading, well, not brimming with confidence either. The passage continues, let me quote from it again. On his cheek, dull and bloodless, a soft stain of ink lay, date-shaped, recent and damp as a snail's bed. Just look at the way Joyce builds this minor, this minuscule character, a plodding, dull boy who has no energy. Cyril Sargent never appears outside this chapter, and yet we know him. He has a splodge of ink on his face, where he obviously pressed his hand to his cheek, having handled a leaky pen. And this is like the spoor, in some way, a snail leaves when it makes his slow way through the world. Incidentally, I have a great joke about a snail, but I won't digress with it now. It will, though, be in my next book. Oh, God. Always the commercial. Well, what of it? Joyce had a patron all his life. He didn't have to worry about the marketplace. Anyway, back to the classroom. He held out his copybook. The word sums was written on the headline. Beneath were sloping figures, and at the foot a crooked signature with blind loops and a blot. I'm hung up on something here, and it's not the word blind, although note that it's a word about eyesight. Eyesight was Joyce's Achilles heel. The word I'm looking at is snail. Why snail? In Ulysses and in all of Joyce, if something isn't immediately obvious, wait. So, we'll return to snail, and I can tell you it's most enjoyable. But in this amazing novel, what isn't once you go looking for it? Let me go back for a second. On his cheek, dull and bloodless, a soft stain of ink lay, date-shaped. More next week.